My grandfather's home was demolished over a $50 landscaping fine while he was in the hospital for heart surgery. What the Oakridge Gardens HOA didn't realize was that they'd just bulldozed the house of Colonel James Harrington, the newly elected president of the National Veterans Housing Association, the organization that oversees funding for every military housing project in the country. I never expected to be fighting a homeowners association at 28 years old. My life had been carefully planned. Graduate from Georgetown, land a job at a prestigious consulting firm, and make enough money to eventually buy my own place in a neighborhood without an HOA. I'd seen how these associations could become little kingdoms with too much power and too little oversight. My grandfather had warned me about them for years. Grandpa James was my hero, a decorated Vietnam veteran with a chest full of medals he never talked about and a lifetime of service he never bragged about. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, he took me in without hesitation, raising me in that modest two-story colonial in Oakridge Gardens that he'd owned since 1975. The house was nothing fancy, but it had history. Every scratch on the hardwood floors told a story. Every family photo on the walls reminded me of where I came from. When Grandpa was appointed as the president of the NVHA 3 months ago, we celebrated with a small dinner at home. It was a position he hadn't sought out. The board had unanimously voted for him after his decades of advocacy for veterans' housing rights. He'd planned to use his new position to reform how housing developments treated veteran homeowners nationwide. The irony of what happened next still makes my blood boil. I was in Chicago for a work conference when I got the call from Grandpa's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "Michael, it's about your grandfather's house," she said, her voice shaking. "You need to come home right away." "What happened? Is Grandpa okay?" My mind immediately went to the worst. He'd had heart problems for years. "James is in the hospital for his scheduled surgery, but that's not why I'm calling. The HOA, they've demolished his house. It's gone, Michael. Everything is gone." I nearly dropped my phone. "What are you talking about? They can't just demolish someone's house. They had some papers, claimed they had approval, something about unpaid fines and repeated violations. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen, said the decision was final. I booked the first flight home, my mind racing. This had to be a mistake. Grandpa was meticulous about maintenance. His lawn was always perfect, a habit from his military days. The only recent issue had been when he couldn't mow for 2 weeks after his first heart procedure. He'd received a warning notice about overgrown grass, but I'd taken care of it myself the weekend after. He'd mentioned a $50 fine that he'd disputed since he had a medical exemption. When my plane landed 6 hours later, I rented a car and drove straight to Oakridge Gardens. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Where my childhood home once stood was nothing but a pile of rubble and broken memories. The two-story colonial where I'd grown up, where my grandfather had taught me to fish and change a tire and be a man, it was gone, completely gone. Mrs. Patterson stood at the edge of the property, tears in her eyes as she watched me take in the destruction. They came yesterday morning with bulldozers. It took them less than 3 hours to erase 45 years of history. I walked through the debris in a daze, occasionally recognizing fragments of our lives. A splintered piece of the dining table where we'd had Sunday dinners, the crushed frame of my parents' wedding photo, Grandpa's medals case cracked open with ribbons and commendations scattered in the dirt. His bronze star lay half buried in the soil, its luster dulled by dust and destruction. As I picked up the medal, something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about a house. This was about respect, dignity, and justice. My grandfather had fought for this country, had bled for the freedoms these people took for granted, and this was how they repaid him. Over a $50 fine for grass that was too long while he was preparing for heart surgery. I pulled out my phone and called the hospital. "Grandpa, had made it through surgery and was stable, but sedated. He didn't know yet. He didn't know that while doctors were operating on his heart, the HOA had destroyed everything he'd built over a lifetime. Who authorized this? I asked Mrs. Patterson, my voice eerily calm despite the rage building inside me. Victoria Blackwell, she replied with disgust. The HOA president. She was here, watching the whole thing like some kind of spectator sport. I nodded slowly, pocketing my grandfather's medal. Where can I find her? Mrs. Patterson pointed down the street to a large Tudor-style home with immaculate landscaping. She works from home on Thursdays. Always has the committee meetings in her dining room. I thanked her and started walking. With each step, the initial shock gave way to cold determination. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea what my grandfather could do. And they certainly had no idea what I was capable of when it came to protecting the only family I had left. Victoria Blackwell was about to learn that some mistakes can't be fixed with an apology, and some enemies are more powerful than she could possibly imagine. Victoria Blackwell's Tudor-style home was everything my grandfather's modest colonial wasn't: ostentatious, imposing, and clearly designed to broadcast status rather than provide comfort. The manicured hedges formed perfect right angles, and not a single blade of grass dared grow taller than its neighbors. This was the home of someone who lived by rules, someone who enforced them with an iron fist. I knocked on the door hard enough to make the decorative wreath bounce. When Victoria answered, I recognized her immediately from the HOA newsletters. Mid-50s, immaculately styled blonde hair, wearing what looked like tennis whites despite no evidence she'd been anywhere near a court. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice clipped and professional. "I'm Michael Harrington, Colonel James Harrington's grandson." I kept my voice level, though it took every ounce of restraint. "I'd like to discuss why you demolished my grandfather's home while he was in heart surgery." Her expression didn't change, but she straightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes, the Harrington property. That's unfortunate. But I'm afraid the board's decision was final. The violations were extensive and long-standing." "May I come in?" I wasn't asking. She hesitated, then stepped aside with practiced hospitality that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I have a meeting in 30 minutes, but I can spare some time." The inside of her home was as pristine as the outside, a showroom rather than a living space. She led me to a formal sitting room and gestured toward an uncomfortable-looking chair while she took the larger sofa. "Mr. Harrington, I understand you're upset, but this decision wasn't made lightly. Your grandfather received multiple notices about code violations over the past 6 months. The final demolition order was only issued after all other remedies. We're exhausted." "Show me," I said. "Excuse me?" "The notices, the violations, the demolition order. I want to see everything." She smiled thinly. "I don't have those documents on hand. You'd need to file a formal request with our HOA secretary." I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo I'd taken of the rubble. "That's what's left of 45 years of my grandfather's life. Do you see that medal in the dirt? That's a Bronze Star. He earned it pulling 3 men to safety under enemy fire in Vietnam. And you bulldozed it over grass that was too long while he was having heart surgery." Something flickered across her face. Not quite remorse, but perhaps the first inkling that she'd miscalculated. She recovered quickly. The $50 landscaping fine was merely the latest in a series of violations. Your grandfather's property had structural issues, unapproved exterior paint, and a non-compliant mailbox. The board voted unanimously. "I want to see that vote record." She stood abruptly. "I think we're done here. If you have concerns about the board's decision, you can address them at the next monthly meeting. First Tuesday of June. That's 3 weeks from now. My grandfather will be out of the hospital next week. Where exactly do you suggest he live?" Victoria straightened a vase of fresh flowers on the coffee table. "That's not the HOA's concern. Perhaps a retirement community would be more appropriate for someone in his condition. As I stared at her, something clicked. The demolition wasn't about violations or fines. There was something else happening here. How much is the lot worth now, Victoria, now that it's cleared? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Confirmation I'd struck a nerve. I don't appreciate what you're implying. I'm not implying anything yet, but I will find out what's going on here. As I left Victoria's perfect Tudor home, I noticed a man watching from a car parked across the street. He quickly looked away when I made eye contact, but not before I recognized him. Martin Greaves, a local developer whose company signs had been popping up around the neighborhood. I made a mental note and headed to my next stop, the Oakridge Gardens HOA office, a small space above the community center. The office was closed, but through the glass door I could see a middle-aged woman sorting papers. I knocked, and she looked up, surprised. After a moment's hesitation, she came to the door. "We're closed until tomorrow," she said through the barely opened door. I introduced myself, and her expression changed immediately. "Oh God, you're James's grandson. I'm Susan Reynolds, the HOA secretary. I'm so sorry about what happened. I've been sick to my stomach since yesterday." "Then you know about the demolition?" She glanced nervously down the hallway. "I shouldn't be talking to you without Victoria present." "Susan, my grandfather is a 72-year-old veteran who just had heart surgery. He's going to wake up to find his home gone. I need to understand how this happened." Her resolve visibly weakened. "Come in quickly." Once inside, Susan pulled a thick file from a cabinet. "This is everything on your grandfather's property. The violations, the notices, everything." I flipped through the file, my suspicions growing with each page. The violations were minor and recent, all occurring in the last 3 months. More importantly, several of the signatures on the inspection reports looked different from each other, as if someone had been practicing my grandfather's signature. "These aren't his signatures," I said, "and half these violations are fabricated. The structural issues mentioned here, the house was inspected by the county last year when Grandpa renovated the bathroom. It passed every code. Susan wouldn't meet my eyes. There's something else you should see." She pulled out another file, this one unmarked. Inside was a development proposal from Greaves Construction for Oakridge Gardens East. Luxury condominiums to be built on a newly acquired 3-acre parcel. "This was approved last month," Susan said quietly. "The parcel they're referring to doesn't exist yet. It would be created by combining 5 lots on Maple Street, including my grandfather's corner lot. They're clearing properties for a development." I said, "The pieces falling into place." Susan nodded. "Your grandfather's isn't the first. The Johnson's place was condemned for black mold that mysteriously appeared after a routine HOA inspection. The Patel's home had an electrical fire while they were visiting family in India. In both cases, the homeowners sold the damaged properties at a loss. To who? Shell companies. But if you trace the ownership..." She didn't need to finish. "Martin Greaves and Victoria Blackwell," I concluded. Susan looked terrified now. "I've already said too much. They can't know I showed you this. I took pictures of everything in both files. They won't. But I need one more thing. The contact information for the Johnsons and the Patels, and anyone else who's lost their home under suspicious circumstances." As Susan wrote down the information, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't just about my grandfather's house anymore. This was organized fraud, using the HOA as a weapon to force people out of their homes for financial gain. "Thank you," I told Susan. "You've been more help than you know." As I left the office, I made a call. Not to a lawyer or the police, but to my grandfather's executive assistant at the National Veterans Housing Association. "Diane, it's Michael Harrington. I need everything you can find on Victoria Blackwell, Martin Greaves, and Greaves Construction, and I need to know exactly what powers my grandfather has as NVHA president when it comes to homeowners associations that violate veterans' housing rights." Diane didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. Should I inform the board?" "Not yet. I want all the facts first. And Diane, let's keep this between us for now. Grandpa doesn't need this stress while he's recovering." I ended the call and looked back at the empty lot where my childhood home had stood. They thought they'd selected an easy target, an elderly veteran with health problems. Instead, they'd demolished the home of the one man with the power and connections to destroy their entire operation, and they had no idea what was coming. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and my grandfather's labored breathing. I sat beside his bed, holding his weathered hand as he slept. The doctors said the surgery had gone well, but at 72, recovery would be slow. I was grateful for the extra time to prepare, to figure out how to tell him his home of 45 years was gone. My phone vibrated with an incoming email from Diane. The subject line read simply, "Found something big." I stepped into the hallway to read it. Diane had been thorough, compiling financial records, property transactions, and board minutes from the Oakridge Gardens HOA going back 5 years. The pattern was even more extensive than Susan had suggested. In the last 3 years, 11 properties had been acquired through suspicious circumstances, all belonging to elderly residents, 4 of them veterans. In each case, the HOA had found violations that led to the owners selling at significantly below market value. But the bombshell was in the attachments. Victoria Blackwell wasn't just working with Martin Greaves. She was married to his brother, Richard Greaves, who served as the silent financial partner in Greaves Construction. The company had been struggling until 3 years ago when they suddenly acquired prime real estate in Oakridge Gardens. Since then, they'd built 2 luxury condo developments, tripling their company's value. The second attachment was even more damning. A draft proposal for Veterans Village, a planned low-income housing development for struggling veterans that would be built by Greaves Construction using federal grants. The land they planned to build on, the same 3-acre parcel they were creating by combining the properties they'd seized, including my grandfather's lot. They were using veterans as a cover story to steal homes from actual veterans. The final document made my blood run cold, a complete breakdown of the powers vested in the president of the National Veterans Housing Association. As the head of the organization that oversees federal funding for veterans' housing initiatives nationwide, my grandfather had the authority to audit, freeze funds, and even recommend criminal investigation of any project involving veterans. Housing! If Victoria and the Greaves brothers knew who they'd targeted, they would have never gone near my grandfather's property. I forwarded everything to my personal email, then composed a new message to Robert Chen, an old college friend who now worked as an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. The subject line, "Corruption in Veterans Housing, Exclusive Story." I attached all the documents and a brief summary, then pressed send. Over the next 3 days, I visited the former homeowners on Susan's list, collecting their stories and documentation. The Johnsons had been pressured to sell after a mysterious mold infestation that 3 independent inspectors couldn't verify the source of. The Patels had returned from India to find their home damaged by a small electrical fire that somehow led to the HOA condemning the entire property. In each case, the pattern was the same. Minor issues escalated to catastrophic consequences, followed by lowball offers from shell companies that traced back to Greaves Construction. By the time my grandfather was strong enough to be told the truth, I had assembled an ironclad case. I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand as I explained what had happened. His face remained impassive as I spoke, the discipline of a military career keeping his emotions in check. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "My medals?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. I pulled his bronze star from my pocket and placed it in his palm. "I found this. I'm still looking for the others." He closed his fingers around it. "The flag? Your grandmother's piano?" I shook my head. "I'm sorry, Grandpa." He took a deep breath, then looked at me with the same steely resolve I'd seen in photographs of him in uniform. "What do we do next?" I showed him everything I'd gathered, the financial records, the testimonies, the shell companies, and the plans for Veterans Village. His expression darkened with each new revelation. "They're using veterans as a smokescreen," he said, his voice stronger now, fueled by righteous anger, "while stealing homes from the very people they claim to help." I nodded. "And they have no idea who you are or what you can do." For the first time since I'd delivered the news, a small smile crossed his face. "Let's keep it that way for now. Call Diane. Tell her to convene an emergency board meeting of the NVHA for tomorrow. Have her set it up here at the hospital. I may be in this bed, but I'm still the president." The next morning, the hospital conference room was filled with the 7 board members of the NVHA, all veterans themselves, ranging from Vietnam to Iraq war service. I stood at the back of the room as my grandfather, propped up in a wheelchair, presented the evidence with military precision. When he finished, the room was silent with collective outrage. Admiral Jackson, the vice president, spoke first. "This is an abuse of everything we stand for. What do you recommend, Mr. President?" My grandfather's voice was steady. "First, we freeze all federal funding for any projects associated with Greaves construction, effective immediately. Second, we refer this case to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Third, we exercise our oversight authority to audit every HOA in the country that has seized or condemned a veteran's property in the last 5 years. The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out, each stopping to shake my grandfather's hand and offer support, I received a text from Robert. "Story running tomorrow, front page. Sources confirm FBI already interested. You've handed them a ready-made case." That evening, I drove to the Oakridge Gardens Community Center, where the HOA was holding its weekly meeting. I slipped into the back of the room as Victoria Blackwell was reviewing the monthly landscaping budget. She faltered slightly when she saw me, but quickly regained her composure. I waited patiently through discussions of pool maintenance and parking violations. When they reached the end of the agenda, I raised my hand. "The chair recognizes Michael Harrington," Victoria said, her voice professionally neutral. I stood, facing not just the board, but the 24 homeowners in attendance. "I'd like to discuss the recent demolition of my grandfather's home at 1452. Maple Street." Victoria's smile tightened. "That matter has been resolved according to HOA bylaws. The property was in violation of multiple codes. Actually," I interrupted, "I have evidence that the violations were fabricated as part of a scheme to acquire properties for the proposed Greaves construction development." A murmur ran through the room. Martin Greaves, sitting in the front row, shifted uncomfortably. Victoria banged her gavel. "This is not the appropriate forum for unfounded accusations." "They're not unfounded," I said, projecting my voice to reach everyone. And you might be interested to know that my grandfather, Colonel James Harrington, is the president of the National Veterans Housing Association, the federal organization that oversees and approves funding for all veterans housing projects. Nationwide, the color drained from Victoria's face. Martin Greaves stood abruptly. Including, I continued, the proposed Veterans Village that Greaves Construction was planning to build using federal grants on land acquired through fraudulent HOA actions. The room erupted in shocked conversations. Victoria banged her gavel, repeatedly, but the control she'd maintained for years was slipping away. As of this morning, I said over the noise, all federal funding for Greaves construction projects has been frozen pending investigation. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit has opened a case, and tomorrow's Washington Post will feature a detailed exposé of everything that's happened here. Martin Greaves bolted for the door. Victoria stood frozen behind the podium, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced weakly, but nobody moved. I turned to address the homeowners directly. "My grandfather may have lost his home, but he's not the only victim. If the HOA has pressured you or someone you know to sell property or pay excessive fines, there will be a team of NVHA lawyers available for consultation starting tomorrow." As I walked out, I could feel Victoria's eyes burning into my back. I turned at the door for one final look at her. The woman who had ordered my grandfather's home destroyed over a $50 fine she knew he disputed. "You picked the wrong veteran to target," I said, just loud enough for her to hear, "and this is just the beginning." The Washington Post article hit like a bomb the next morning. Robert had done a masterful job, weaving together the personal tragedy of my grandfather's demolished home with the broader pattern of corruption. By noon, every major news outlet had picked up the story, with headlines highlighting the irony: HOA destroys veterans housing president's home, and corrupt HOA targets war hero, regrets it immediately. The Oakridge Gardens Community Center was transformed into a makeshift legal clinic, with NVHA lawyers speaking to a steady stream of homeowners. Stories that had been whispered for years were finally being told openly. Excessive fines, selective enforcement, intimidation tactics. The pattern extended far beyond the 11 properties I'd initially identified. Victoria Blackwell was nowhere to be seen, but rumors spread that FBI agents had been spotted at both her home and the Greaves construction offices. Martin Greaves' attorney released a statement claiming his client had been misled about the property acquisitions, attempting to shift all blame to Victoria and his brother Richard. 3 days after the story broke, my grandfather was discharged from the hospital. I had arranged a rental house nearby, but as we drove past his demolished property, he asked me to stop. He sat in the passenger seat for a long moment, staring at the empty lot where his home had stood. Then, with determination that belied his recent surgery, he pushed the car door open. "Grandpa, you should rest. I need to see it, Michael." I helped him out of the car, supporting his weight as we walked to the center of what had once been our family home. The rubble had been cleared away, leaving nothing but bare earth and a few scattered bits of foundation. Grandpa bent down with a grimace and picked up a tarnished doorknob, the last remnant of the front door where he'd hung a wreath every Christmas. "For decades, your grandmother and I bought this house when I came back from Vietnam," he said quietly. "Nobody wanted to hire vets back then. Nobody wanted to give us loans. We scraped together every penny for the down payment." I stood silently beside him, letting him process the loss in his own way. "I helped build the Johnson's deck," he continued, "taught old man Patel how to fix a water heater. We were a community before the HOA took over." He looked around at the neighboring houses where several residents had come outside, watching us with sympathy. Maybe we can be again. A week later, the first arrests were made. Victoria Blackwell, Richard Greaves, and 3 HOA board members were led away in handcuffs, charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and misappropriation of funds. Martin Greaves had turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing prosecutors with detailed records of every transaction. The investigation expanded beyond Oakridge Gardens, with the NVHA audit identifying similar patterns in 16 other communities across 5 states. The scandal prompted congressional hearings on HOA oversight and veterans' housing protections. The day after the arrests, my grandfather convened a special meeting of the NVHA board in a proper conference room, his strength returning with each passing day. I sat in as they unanimously approved a new initiative, the Veterans Housing Protection Act, which would establish an oversight committee to review any HOA action against a veteran homeowner before it could be enforced. This won't just help the veterans in Oakridge Gardens, my grandfather explained to the board. This will protect veterans in every community in America. What happened to me was a tragedy. But if we can prevent it from happening to even one other veteran, something good will have come from it. 2 months after the demolition, I stood with my grandfather at the edge of his empty lot, now cleared and graded, as he reviewed architectural plans with a contractor. "Are you sure about this, Grandpa? You could build a new home for yourself." He shook his head. "I'm sure. This is exactly what this community needs." The plans called for a modest community center with meeting rooms, a small library, and office space for financial counseling and legal aid services, specifically for veterans and elderly residents. The sign out front would read, Harrington Veterans Community Center, with a subtitle, Neighbors Helping Neighbors. The NVHA board approved the funding yesterday, he told me, pride evident in his voice. And 5 other neighborhood associations have already reached out about establishing similar centers. As we talked, a car pulled up and Susan Reynolds stepped out, clutching a folder. Since coming forward, she had become the acting administrator for the Transitional Homeowners Committee that had replaced the corrupt HOA board. "Colonel Harrington," she said nervously, "I have something for you." She opened the folder to reveal a collection of photographs, family pictures that had once hung on my grandfather's walls, now creased and slightly damaged. "I saved what I could before the demolition," she explained. "I didn't know who you were, but I knew what they were doing. Was wrong. I hid these in my car that morning." My grandfather's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the photos. Images of my parents' wedding, my childhood birthdays, his late wife's smile preserved across decades. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "These are worth more than the house itself." The final justice came 6 months later, when Victoria Blackwell and Richard Greaves were sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The judge, a Vietnam veteran himself, made a point of noting the particular cruelty of targeting elderly veterans who had served their country. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed my grandfather, now fully recovered and standing tall in a suit adorned with his service pins. "Colonel Harrington, how do you feel about the sentencing?" one reporter called out. Grandpa considered the question carefully. This case was never about revenge. It was about accountability. These individuals abused a position of trust to victimize the very people they were supposed to serve. The sentence sends a message that such behavior won't be tolerated. "What about your home?" another asked. "Homes can be rebuilt," he replied. "What matters is the community we create. In Oakridge Gardens, neighbors are looking out for each other." Again, the new community center will break ground next month, and the Veterans Housing Protection Act is already helping homeowners across the country. As the media dispersed, I walked with my grandfather to the car. "You know," I said, "when I was gathering evidence against Victoria and the Greaves brothers, I was driven by anger. I wanted them to pay for what they'd done to you." He nodded. "Anger has its place. It can motivate us to fight injustice, but what we build afterward is what truly matters." We drove past his old lot on the way home, now bustling with construction activity as the foundation for the community centre took shape. Neighbours waved as we passed, many stopping to chat with the man who had transformed their community by standing up to corruption. My grandfather had lost his home, but found a new purpose. The HOA that had sought to bully an elderly veteran had instead awakened a force for nationwide reform. And Victoria Blackwell, who had demolished a house over a $50 fine, had discovered, too late, that she'd targeted not just any veteran, but the one man with the power, connections, and moral authority to bring her entire operation crashing down. As we pulled into the driveway of his new home, a single-story ranch better suited to his recovery, my grandfather looked at me with the same determined expression he'd worn in his military photographs. "You know what the real victory is, Michael?" he asked. "What's that, Grandpa?" "The victory is that the next time someone in power thinks about taking advantage of a veteran, they'll remember what happened here. They'll remember that we take care of our own. And maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice." I nodded, knowing he was right. His demolished home had become the foundation for something far more important, a movement that would protect veterans' housing rights for generations to come. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the wrong house is demolished for all the right reasons.